In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, one immutable truth defines the Orks. They will fight anything, anywhere, for any reason or no reason at all. These green-skinned Xenos thrive on violence. They're born for battle, engineered millennia ago by the Old Ones as living weapons during the war in heaven. Combat isn't just what Orks do, it's what they are at their very core. The psychic gestalt field they generate, the field, literally grows stronger through fighting. Their entire society revolves around who can hit the hardest, who's the biggest, and who's won the most scraps. From the lowliest grot to the mightiest war boss, every greenskin exists in a state of perpetual warfare, seeking out new enemies to crump with gleeful abandon. Orks have charged headlong into tyrannid swarms that would make veteran space marines falter. They've gleefully thrown themselves against Necron warriors wielding weapons that can flay them to atoms. They laugh as they crash into Imperial Guard battle lines, relishing the carnage. They've assaulted Chaos Space Marines corrupted by the Dark Gods themselves, finding the mutation-twisted traitors to be proper Orky opponents. They've even invaded the Eye of Terror specifically to fight demons, with war boss Tusker Demon Killer earning eternal resurrection from Khorne himself, because the Blood God enjoyed watching the Ork fight so much. The Greenskins have no concept of a fight too dangerous, no understanding of odds too overwhelming. Their philosophy is simple. If it bleeds, you can kill it. And if it doesn't bleed, you can still smash it to bits and have a laugh about it afterward. Yet in all the vast expanse of the galaxy, across all the countless battlefields, soaked in the blood of a million worlds, there exists a foe that even Orks will not willingly engage. A warrior so terrifying, so utterly beyond the pale of what constitutes a good scrap, that the Greenskins' innate survival instincts override their burning desire for violence. We're not talking about regular Adeptus Custodes, those golden demigods who serve as the Emperor's personal bodyguard. Orks will fight those, though rarely and usually at significant cost. No, we're discussing something far more dangerous, far more ancient, and far more terrifying. The ancient Custodian Dreadnoughts, those towering war machines that house the consciousness of the Emperor's finest warriors, entombed within shells of auramite and adamantium. These are not the Dreadnoughts you see lumbering through Space Marine battle lines. Custodian Dreadnoughts are to regular Astartes Dreadnoughts what a Primarch is to a standard human soldier. They are relics from the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, each one a masterwork of technology that the Imperium can no longer fully replicate. Inside each adamantine sarcophagus rests a custodian whose body was shattered beyond even their remarkable capacity for healing, yet whose mind and warrior spirit remain undimmed. These are individuals who once stood in the presence of the Emperor himself, who trained for decades to reach a level of martial perfection that would put entire companies of space marines to shame, and who now pilot war machines equipped with weapons and defensive systems that represent the pinnacle of Imperial technology from humanity's golden age. The question that drives this exploration is deceptively simple. Why won't Orks fight them? What is it about these particular enemies that breaks through the Greenskins' overwhelming compulsion toward violence? To understand this seemingly impossible exception to the Ork nature, we must delve deep into the psychology of the Greenskins, examine the true capabilities of Custodian Dreadnoughts, and explore what happens when an unstoppable force of pure aggression meets an immovable object of perfect destruction. The answer reveals fascinating truths about both species and illuminates one of the most interesting dynamics in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Ork psyche, violence as existence. To understand why Orks avoid Custodian Dreadnoughts, we first need to truly comprehend what drives the Greenskins. This requires moving beyond the surface-level perception of Orks as mindless brutes and recognizing the sophisticated, if alien, psychology that governs their behavior. Orks are not stupid, despite what their crude technology and brutish appearance might suggest. They possess a form of intelligence that's fundamentally different from human cognition. operating on principles that would seem contradictory to any other species, but make perfect sense within the Orkoid worldview. The foundation of Ork psychology is the WAG, that Gestalt psychic field, generated by all greenskins. This isn't simply some mystical energy that makes their ramshackle technology function, though it does serve that purpose. The field is the collective consciousness of the Ork species, a psychic network that connects every greenskin across the galaxy. When Orks gather in large numbers, the field grows stronger, creating a feedback loop of aggression and confidence. This field allows Orks to instinctively recognize who's bigger, and therefore, who's in charge. It's why Ork society functions despite having no formal government, no written laws, and no diplomatic institutions. The biggest, meanest Ork naturally becomes the boss, because every other Ork can feel his dominance through the wah. But the field serves another crucial purpose that's often overlooked. It's a survival mechanism. Despite their love of fighting, Orks aren't suicidal. They're designed to be resilient, adaptable, and ultimately successful as a species. The old ones engineered them to be the perfect soldiers, and perfect soldiers need to know when to fight and when to retreat. The field provides this crucial information. When an Ork faces an enemy, the WAG helps them assess the threat level, the potential for a good scrap, and whether charging in will result in a fun fight or pointless death. This is where most people misunderstand Ork behavior. Orks don't just fight for the sake of fighting, they fight for the joy of fighting. There's a critical difference. A joyful fight is one where the Ork has a chance, where there's back and forth violence, where they can test their strength and cunning, and where victory is possible even if unlikely. Orks will charge into fights with terrible odds because terrible odds can still result in a proper scrap. 10 to 1? That's a good time. 100 to 1? Even better. The problem comes when the fight stops being a fight and becomes an execution. Orks retreat more often than most people realize. The Ork saying goes, "We didn't lose, we just ran away to come back and have another go." This isn't just Ork logic justifying cowardice. It's a genuine strategic understanding. If a fight isn't winnable and isn't fun, there's no point in dying pointlessly when you could go find a better scrap somewhere else. The Bloodaxe's clan has built their entire culture around tactical retreats, using human military concepts like camouflage and strategic withdrawal. Other clans mock them for being un-Orky, but the Bloodaxes are highly successful because they understand something fundamental. The best fight is the one you can win, and if you can't win this one, you fall back to fight another day. The key word there is can. The Bloodaxes retreat when they can't win a particular engagement at that moment, but they always believe they can eventually win if they come back with more boys, bigger guns, or a different approach. This distinction is crucial. Orks will withdraw from fights they're losing, but they don't avoid fights they fundamentally cannot win in any circumstance. The reason is simple. Those fights don't exist in the Ork worldview. Give them enough boys, enough Daka, enough time, and Orks believe they can crump anything. It's baked into their genetic memory from the days when they were Krorks. 12-meter-tall super warriors who fought against the Necrons and Satan during the war in heaven. Fear exists in the Ork psyche, though they experience it differently than humans do. When Angron and his World Eaters Legion fought Orks, the Greenskins were documented as stampeding over each other to escape the demon Primarch. Sebastian Yarrick, the legendary commissar of the Imperial Guard, earned such respect from Orks that they genuinely feared facing him in battle. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka himself, the prophet of the field and arguably the most powerful Ork warlord in the current era, has been known to spare Yarrick's life specifically so they could fight again, recognizing the old man as a worthy opponent rather than just another Humie to crump. But notice the pattern in these examples. Angron was a Primarch empowered by chaos, yet Orks still charged at him before breaking. Yarrick was a mortal human, albeit an exceptional one, and Orks would still fight him. They just fought cautiously. These enemies were dangerous, yes, but they existed within the realm of comprehensible threats. You could measure yourself against them. You might lose, but you could understand how the fight would go. Orks possess an intuitive understanding of combat mathematics that's actually quite sophisticated. They can instantly assess whether an enemy is a boy, a knob, or a boss-level threat. They know whether their choppers will hurt something or if they need their power claws. They understand when they need more dakka and when they need to get in close for a good crumping. This battlefield intelligence operates largely through the field, which provides real-time data about threats, opportunities, and the overall flow of battle. The field is also how orcs experience what other species would call morale. When the battle is going well and the boys are having fun, the surges with positive energy. Orcs fight harder, laugh louder, and become even more dangerous. When things go badly, when the boss is killed and the boys start dying without accomplishing anything, the weakens. Individual orcs begin to think more clearly about their immediate survival, rather than the collective glory of battle. This is when retreats happen, when the mob breaks and the greenskins scatter to regroup later. Here's the crucial point. The field doesn't just respond to what's happening, it anticipates what will happen. Orcs can sense when they're about to walk into a meat grinder. They might do it anyway if it seems fun, but they know. This precognitive element of the is what makes orcs so dangerous and so difficult to trap. They have an almost supernatural ability to avoid ambushes, to sense when a position is too heavily defended, or to know when an enemy is hiding something nasty just around the corner. This brings us to the heart of why Custodian Dreadnoughts present such a unique problem. When orcs encounter these ancient war machines, the wah field doesn't just warn them of danger. It screams, it howls with a message so clear, so undeniable, that even the most battle-crazed orc cannot ignore it. This is not a fight. This is death. There is no winning, no glory, no fun. There is only ending. The Golden Tomb. Warriors, what Custodian Dreadnoughts are. To understand why Custodian Dreadnoughts inspire such dread, we need to examine what they truly are. These are not merely oversized suits of armor with guns bolted on. Each Custodian Dreadnought represents the culmination of technologies and craftsmanship that the Imperium of the 41st Millennium can no longer replicate. They are relics from the Great Crusade, from a time when the Emperor walked among his servants and the secrets of the Dark Age of technology were still partially understood. Every component, every weapon system, every defensive field is a masterwork created by the finest artificers in the service of the imperial court. The interment of a custodian into a dreadnought is fundamentally different from the process used for space marines. When an Astartes is entombed, they are placed within a sarcophagus that contains life support systems designed to keep their injured body alive while interfacing with the dreadnought's systems. The result is functional but crude by comparison to what happens with a custodian. The custodes' interment process is an act of martyrdom, a final sacrifice made by warriors who have already given everything to serve the emperor. The custodian's body is reduced to its absolute essentials: brain matter, vital organs, and the bare minimum of tissue needed to sustain consciousness. This biological remainder is suspended in an amniotic tank of armor glass, surrounded by life support fluids and nutrient solutions developed over millennia. The resulting consciousness is then permanently fused with the dreadnought systems at a level that goes far beyond the interface used for space marine pilots. The custodian doesn't operate the dreadnought. They become the dreadnought. Its limbs are their limbs, its sensors their eyes and ears, its weapons their fists and blades. This complete integration means that custodian dreadnoughts retain the full combat prowess of the warrior entombed within. The Adeptus Custodes are not mass-produced soldiers like space marines. Each custodian is handcrafted by the Emperor's own designs, beginning their transformation in infancy through processes that make Astartes' creation look crude by comparison. They train for decades, sometimes centuries, to master every form of combat, every weapon, every tactical scenario. They study philosophy, warfare, psychology, and countless other disciplines. They are generals, bodyguards, assassins, and champions, all rolled into one golden form. A single Custodian is worth a squad of Space Marines in combat, and that's a conservative estimate from official Imperial assessments. When that level of skill and experience is translated into a Dreadnought chassis, the result is terrifying. The pilot retains all their martial knowledge, all their tactical acumen, all their centuries of battlefield experience. But now they wield it through a body that can shrug off Lascanon fire, that moves with hydraulic strength, capable of crushing battle tanks, that carries weapons designed specifically for the Custodian Guard's unique requirements. Let's examine the specific patterns of Custodian Dreadnoughts to understand what makes them so formidable. The Contemptor Achilles was the most common variant during the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. The term common is relative, as fewer than 100 of these war machines existed even at the height of the Crusade. The Achilles pattern combines phenomenal strength and speed with weapons that would be unwieldy for any pilot less skilled than a Custodian. Its primary armament is the Dread Spear, a massive power weapon modeled after the Guardian spears carried by regular Custodians but scaled up to match the Dreadnought's size. This isn't just a big stick with a power field. The Dread Spear incorporates a Corvée Las Pulsar, a directed energy weapon, turning the weapon into both a devastating melee implement and a precision-ranged tool. The Contemptor Achilles typically mounts additional weapons including Infernus incinerators, which are essentially scaled-up heavy flamers that can purge entire squads of infantry in seconds, or Adrathic destructors, exotic weapons that completely disintegrate matter at the molecular level. These Adrathic weapons are Dark Age technology that the Mechanicum can no longer produce, making each one irreplaceable. The Achilles also benefits from an advanced atomantic shielding system, the same technology that would later be adapted into storm shields for Terminator armor. This shielding can dispel energy weapons and deflect projectiles that would obliterate normal armor. The Contemptor Galatus represents a different battlefield role. Where the Achilles is a versatile general-purpose war machine, the Galatus is designed to serve as an anchor point for Custodian battle lines. It wields the massive Galatus Warblade, a Dreadnought-sized power sword that the pilot swings with the same skill they once used to wield a regular blade. The Warblade incorporates twin-linked Infernus incinerators, allowing the Galatus to cleanse infantry while engaging heavier targets with its blade. But the Galatus's most distinctive feature is its Presidium shield, a massively upscaled version of the energy-reinforced shields carried by Sentinel Guard Custodians. This Presidium shield makes the Galatus almost impregnable. Already protected by auramite armor plating and atomantic shielding, the addition of the Presidium creates a defensive capability that can withstand anti-tank weapons with contemptuous ease. The Galatus was specifically designed to stand at the forefront of Custodian formations, weathering the heaviest enemy fire while its fellows advanced under its protection. In this role, it excels beyond any other war machine in the Imperium's arsenal. Imagine a wall that kills you, moves toward you with inexorable purpose, and cannot be broken through conventional firepower. That's the Galatus. Then there's the Telemon Heavy Dreadnought, and here we enter the realm of the truly terrifying. During the Horus Heresy, fewer than a handful of these massive machines existed within the entire Custodian Guard. The honor of interment in a Telemon sarcophagus was reserved for only the most celebrated warriors. The Telemon is significantly larger than standard Contemptor patterns, mounting weapon systems that would require dedicated weapon platforms on any other battlefield unit. Arachnus storm cannons, Iliastus accelerator culverins, or Telemon Kesti power fists, with built-in plasma projectors, serve as its primary armaments, while a back-mounted spiculous bolt launcher provides additional fire support. The Telemon represents the philosophy that drove Custodian war machine design, overwhelming superiority in every possible metric. It doesn't just outfight enemy units, it dominates them so completely that their presence on the battlefield becomes meaningless. A Telemon Heavy Dreadnought was intended to stand sentinel over its charges, no matter what forces were arrayed against it. And crucially, rare is the foe who can stand against the array of esoteric, handcrafted weapons on its chassis, combined with the ferocious will and warrior skill of the Master Custodian interred within. All Custodian Dreadnoughts share certain characteristics that set them apart from their Space Marine counterparts. They're armored in auramite, not standard ceramite. Auramite is the material used in Custodian armor, far superior to anything used by the Adeptus Astartes. It's lighter, stronger, and more resistant to both energy and kinetic weapons. The Dreadnought chassis itself is built to tolerances that exceed even the advanced manufacturing of Space Marine Dreadnoughts. Every joint, every servo, every system is crafted to perfection by artificers who serve the Imperial court. The weapons mounted on Custodian Dreadnoughts aren't mass-produced. Each one is handcrafted, blessed and inscribed with wards and oaths. The ammunition isn't standard-issue bolt rounds or lascelles. These are specialized munitions created specifically for these weapons, sometimes using materials or techniques that the rest of the Imperium doesn't have access to. When a Custodian Dreadnought fires its weapons, each shot represents a level of destructive potential that goes beyond simple caliber or energy output. The sensoria systems are equally sophisticated. While a Space Marine Dreadnought pilot experiences a simplified interface showing friend or foe identifications and target priorities, a Custodian Dreadnought perceives the battlefield with clarity approaching their original senses. Advanced cogitators process millions of data points per second, but the pilot's augmented consciousness can actually comprehend this information stream. They can identify individual enemies at extreme ranges, track multiple threats simultaneously, and process tactical information faster than most commanders' entire staff could manage. The auto-repair protocols built into Custodian Dreadnoughts allow them to shrug off damage that would cripple other machines. Damaged systems automatically reroute through backups. Breached armor plates seal themselves using emergency materials stored throughout the chassis. If a primary weapon system fails, secondary systems engage without any delay or loss in combat effectiveness. The Dreadnought has redundancies upon redundancies, each one capable of keeping the machine in the fight, even after suffering catastrophic damage. Perhaps most importantly, Custodian Dreadnoughts retain the complete tactical flexibility that defined the pilot's original fighting style. Space Marine Dreadnoughts, while formidable, are essentially slow-moving fire support platforms. They provide heavy firepower and can engage in melee if necessary, but they're not nimble or adaptable. Custodian Dreadnoughts are different. Despite their size and bulk, they move with precision and purpose. They can engage targets at range with devastating accuracy, then close to melee distance with surprising speed. The pilot's centuries of martial training translate into a fighting style that adapts to every situation, exploiting enemy weaknesses and creating opportunities where none existed before. There's also a psychological dimension to these war machines that shouldn't be overlooked. Each Custodian Dreadnought houses a warrior who stood in the presence of the Emperor. They fought during the Great Crusade, when the Imperium was at its height. They likely participated in battles that are now the stuff of legend. The pilot's consciousness contains memories of times and places that no longer exist, of victories and defeats that shaped the galaxy. When a Custodian Dreadnought takes to the battlefield, it carries with it the weight of 10,000 years of history, of duty unfulfilled, and of a warrior's oath that transcends death itself. The first Custodian ever interred in a Dreadnought was Sagittarius Malak, one of the original 30 Custodians created by the Emperor's own hand. He served during the Unification Wars, fighting beside the Master of Mankind when terror itself was still divided among countless warlords and tyrants. When Sagittarius was finally wounded unto death, the Emperor himself ordered his interment, creating the first of the Moritoi caste, as the Dreadnought pilots would come to be known. This established the precedent that would continue for thousands of years. Only in death does duty end, and for a Custodian, even death is insufficient reason to cease serving. The unstoppable versus the uncrumpable. When we examine Custodian Dreadnoughts, in direct comparison to standard Space Marine Dreadnoughts, the gulf in capability becomes immediately apparent. This isn't merely a matter of better equipment or more skilled pilots, though both of those factors play significant roles. The difference is fundamental, built into every aspect of design and implementation. Space Marine Dreadnoughts are mass-produced war machines, relatively speaking. While each one is still a venerated relic, the Mechanicum can still produce new Dreadnought chassis using established patterns and known technologies. Custodian Dreadnoughts, by contrast, incorporate technologies that the Imperium can no longer fully replicate or understand. Let's start with basic specifications. A standard Castroferrum pattern Dreadnought, the most common type seen in Space Marine chapters, stands roughly 4 meters tall and masses approximately 12 tons. It mounts a combination of ranged and melee weapons, typically a multi-melter or assault cannon, paired with a Dreadnought close combat weapon. Armor is heavy ceramite throughout, proof against most small arms and resistant to anti-armor weapons, though sustained fire from heavy weapons will eventually breach it. The pilot interface is sophisticated by Imperial standards, but crude compared to Dark Age technology. Reaction times are slower than a normal Space Marine because of the slight delay in neural interface, and while the pilot retains much of their combat knowledge, they don't fight with quite the same fluidity they possessed in life. A Custodian Contemptor, even the basic version without specialized equipment, dramatically exceeds these specifications in every category. It stands over 5 meters tall, substantially larger than a Castroferrum. The mass is significantly greater due to the dense auramite armor and more robust internal structure. Where a Space Marine Dreadnought mounts weapons that would be carried by their regular infantry, Custodian Dreadnoughts carry armaments specifically designed for their unique chassis. The difference isn't just one of scale, it's one of fundamental capability. The atomantic shielding alone represents a defensive system without equivalent in standard Astartes war machines. When a Custodian Dreadnought is hit by a lascannon, the atomantic shield disperses the energy in a brilliant flare. The auramite armor underneath might not even be scratched. Contrast this with a Space Marine Dreadnought, where repeated lascannon hits will eventually breach the armor and damage critical systems. The Custodian version doesn't just survive longer under fire, it's operating under entirely different rules of engagement. But the real difference emerges in combat performance, and here we have historical examples that demonstrate the gap. The Battle of Gyros Thravian during the Great Crusade provides our most detailed account of Custodian combat effectiveness on a large scale. The Primarchs Horus, Rogel Dawn, and Mortarion, leading their respective legions, found themselves vastly outnumbered by the Ork warlord Garkle Blackfang's massive Wah! These weren't just any Orks. They were led by one of the most powerful warlords ever encountered up to that point, commanding a horde large enough to threaten 3 entire Space Marine legions simultaneously. The situation was dire enough that the Emperor himself intervened, leading an assault from his golden battle barge, Bucephalus. At the head of 1,000 Custodians, he struck at the heart of the Ork horde. The Emperor personally confronted Garkle atop a towering gargant, decapitating the giant warlord in single combat. But it was the Custodians who carried out the systematic slaughter that followed. They laid waste to the warlord's prime warriors, the biggest and most dangerous Orks in the entire field. Within moments, over 100,000 greenskins died and the field was broken completely. The casualty ratio is what should give any tactician pause. Over 100,000 Orks killed by 1,000 Custodians. That's a ratio of 100 to 1. And the Custodian casualties? 3. 3 Custodians fell in that entire battle, their names enshrined forever and engraved on the Emperor's own armor. 3 losses against 100,000 killed. Let that sink in for a moment. The Custodians didn't just win that engagement, they executed it with a precision and efficiency that borders on the incomprehensible. Now, imagine that same level of skill and lethality but encased in a war machine that multiplies their already superhuman capabilities. That's what a Custodian Dreadnought represents. Take a warrior capable of carving through hundreds of enemies without falling. Give them a body that cannot tire and can shrug off wounds that would kill them instantly in flesh. Arm them with weapons that would require vehicles to carry in any other army, and shield them with defensive systems that make them effectively invulnerable to most weaponry. The result is something that transcends normal battlefield calculations. The mathematical reality of facing a Custodian Dreadnought becomes clear when we examine theoretical engagement scenarios. Imagine a standard Ork mob of 30 boys charging a Custodian Dreadnought. The Dreadnought would identify them at maximum sensor range, likely several kilometers away. As they approach, its ranged weapons would begin engaging. Let's say it's equipped with an assault cannon and a Drathic destructor. The assault cannon alone can fire several hundred rounds per minute, each one capable of killing multiple Orks if they're clustered together. In the first burst, before the Orks have covered even a quarter of the distance, 10 of them would simply cease to exist, their bodies atomized by a Drathic energy or torn apart by mass-reactive shells. The mob keeps coming because Orks are nothing if not brave. At 200 meters, the Dreadnought's secondary weapons engage. If it has Infernus incinerators, gouts of superheated promethium wash over the charging greenskins. Ork flesh is tough, but nothing survives being bathed in flames hot enough to melt ceramite. Another 10 Orks die screaming, or more accurately, die so quickly they don't have time to scream. The survivors press on because the Wag is strong, and they can see the enemy now. That golden giant standing there like it's challenging them to get close enough for a proper crumping. At 50 meters, any remaining Orks would be in range to throw their stick bombs. These crude grenades might actually damage a regular Dreadnought if enough of them hit in the same place. Against Oromite armor, protected by atomantic shielding, they accomplish nothing but creating smoke and noise. The Dreadnought adjusts its targeting to account for the visual interference and continues firing. It doesn't rush, doesn't panic, doesn't make mistakes. It simply continues applying lethal force with mechanical precision, backed by centuries of combat experience. If, by some miracle, the last few Orks reach melee range, they get to experience the other side of Custodian combat doctrine. The Dreadnought's close combat weapon, whether it's a power fist, a dread spear, or a Galatus warblade, sweeps through them like they're not even there. A single blow from a Dreadnought-scale power weapon wielded by a master warrior doesn't just kill an Ork, it removes them from existence in an instant. There's no parry, no block, no defensive maneuver that would help. The weight, speed, and power behind each strike ensures that anything hit simply stops being. And this is just one Custodian Dreadnought against a standard mob. Now consider what happens when you scale this up. What if it's a Telemon heavy Dreadnought facing a significantly larger force? What if the Orks bring their own vehicles, their battle wagons and death dreads? The mathematics don't improve for the greenskins, they get worse. Custodian Dreadnoughts are specifically designed to engage enemy armor. Their weapons can punch through the thick plates of an Ork vehicle as easily as they carve through infantry. Meanwhile, Ork guns, even their biggest shooters and rockets, struggle to penetrate the layered defenses of Oromite armor and atomantic shielding. The speed differential creates additional problems for Ork forces. One might assume that a Dreadnought, being large and heavily armored, would be slow and ponderous. Space Marine Dreadnoughts certainly are, plodding forward with inevitable purpose but limited maneuverability. Custodian Dreadnoughts move with a fluidity that seems impossible for their size. The servo motors and hydraulic systems that power their limbs are masterworks of engineering, providing both tremendous power and precise control. A Custodian Dreadnought can change direction mid-stride, pivot to engage threats from multiple angles, and position itself with tactical sophistication that reflects the pilot's centuries of experience. This mobility means that Orks can't simply swarm the Dreadnought from all sides, overwhelming it through sheer numbers. The machine maintains optimal fighting position at all times, using terrain and movement to ensure that enemies approach from directions where it can bring maximum firepower to bear. It fights like a person, not like a vehicle, because the consciousness piloting it is still fundamentally a person, albeit one wearing a body of auramite and adamantium. The psychological impact of watching a Custodian Dreadnought fight cannot be overstated. For enemies who understand what they're seeing, it's a demonstration of absolute martial superiority. For Orks, who experience combat through their Gestalt field, it's something else entirely. The field allows them to sense the flow of battle, to feel when their side is winning or losing, to recognize threats and opportunities. When facing a Custodian Dreadnought, the field transmits a very simple, very clear message. This is not a winnable fight. Orks have faced long odds before. They've charged into situations where they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. The difference in those cases was that victory remained theoretically possible. If you got lucky, if you hit the right spot, if enough of your boys survived to pile on, you might win. The field helps Orks recognize these slim chances and encourages them to take them, because even a slim chance of victory is worth dying for. Against a Custodian Dreadnought, there is no slim chance. There is no weak spot to exploit, no moment of vulnerability to capitalize on, no way to bring enough force to bear quickly enough to matter. The machine will methodically, efficiently, and inevitably destroy everything that challenges it. It will do this without tiring, without making mistakes, and without any possibility of being overwhelmed through numbers. For a species whose entire culture revolves around fighting, the Custodian Dreadnought represents something almost incomprehensible. A fight that's not worth taking because it's not really a fight at all. This recognition happens at a subconscious level through the field. Individual Orks might not be able to articulate why they're suddenly finding somewhere else to be when a golden giant appears on the battlefield. Their conscious mind might insist they're just repositioning for a better angle of attack, or going to find a proper foe who'll give them a good scrap. But the truth is that every Ork in proximity to a Custodian Dreadnought feels an overwhelming instinct screaming at them, not that one. When greenskins see golden gods. The Ork ability to recognize and respond to threats operates on both conscious and unconscious levels, and understanding this dual-natured assessment is crucial to grasping why Custodian Dreadnoughts trigger such a strong avoidance response. On the conscious level, Orks are surprisingly sophisticated tactical thinkers. They can evaluate enemy forces, identify priority targets, and develop strategies, albeit crude ones by human standards. A war boss planning an attack knows which enemies are shooty gits that need to be closed with quickly, which ones are proper hard and might require more boys, and which ones are just fodder to be swept aside by the green tide. This conscious assessment relies heavily on experience and cultural knowledge passed down through the Ork Gestalt consciousness. Young Orks instinctively know what a space marine is and that they require more effort to kill than regular humies. They understand that tanks need bigger weapons than shooters to crack open. They recognize that some enemies fight better than others and adjust their approach accordingly. This knowledge isn't learned through education or training. It's baked into their genetic memory, part of the instinctive understanding that makes Orks such effective warriors, despite their apparent lack of formal military structure. But the field provides a deeper, more primal assessment that operates below conscious thought. This is where the real danger evaluation happens. The doesn't just identify threats. It evaluates whether those threats can be overcome through Orky principles of bigger, faster, and more Daka. When an Ork looks at a tank, the field tells them, big, but we can crump it. When they see a space marine, the field says, hard to kill, but killable. Even when facing terrifying enemies like greater demons or tyrannid hive tyrants, the maintains a baseline message. This is dangerous, but we can win. The field's assessment is based on complex calculations that occur instantaneously across the Ork Gestalt consciousness. It's measuring the enemy's psychic presence, their martial capabilities, the threat they represent both individually and as part of a larger force. It's comparing this to the strength of the local WAG, the number and quality of boys available, the presence of particular Ork advantages like numbers or surprise. All of this happens faster than thought, producing an intuitive understanding of whether a fight is worth taking. Historical examples show us exactly what this looks like in practice. During the Third War for Armageddon, Commissar Yarrick faced Ork forces that had explicitly been ordered by their war bosses to capture or kill him. The Greenskins recognized Yarrick as a significant enemy, Old Baali, who had earned their respect through decades of fighting. Yet even with direct orders and the promise of great prestige, Orks still hesitated before engaging him. The field was telling them that while Yarrick could be killed, the cost would be high, and maybe they should let some other Git have the honor of trying first. He represented a threat that was significant enough to make individual Orks recalculate their personal cost-benefit analysis of charging straight at him. Contrast this with how Orks behaved when facing the demon Primarch Angron during the First War for Armageddon. Here was an enemy that should have been utterly terrifying, a being of such martial power that even Space Marines fled before him. Yet Orks charged Angron's forces with their typical enthusiasm. Yes, many of them died. Yes, some mobs broke and fled when they saw what Angron did to their fellows, but they still tried. The field identified Angron as extremely dangerous, but not fundamentally unkillable. He was just a really big, really angry Git. Given enough boys and enough time, they could wear him down. They were wrong, of course, but the crucial point is that the option existed in their collective consciousness. This brings us to the specific case of Custodian Dreadnoughts, and why the field's response to them is categorically different. When Orks encounter Adeptus Custodes in general, the field registers them as extremely dangerous humies. The Golden Warriors are clearly superior to regular humans, obviously tougher and more skilled than even Space Marines, but they're still humanoid, still limited to human scale, still operating within parameters that Orks can comprehend. A Custodian might kill 10 or 20 Orks before going down, but they will eventually go down if you throw enough bodies at them. The might suggest that directly charging a squad of Custodes is a bad idea, but it doesn't trigger the fundamental avoidance response. Custodian Dreadnoughts break this calculus completely. The field tries to evaluate them using its normal threat assessment protocols, and simply cannot find a win condition. The machine is too tough to break with conventional Ork weapons. It's too skilled to overwhelm with numbers, because it can reposition faster than the mob can swarm it. It has too much firepower to approach safely, killing Orks faster than they can close the distance. And unlike other threats that tick some of these boxes, the Custodian Dreadnought has no apparent weaknesses to exploit. The field is, in essence, trying to solve an equation with no solution. How many boys would it take to bring down a Custodian Dreadnought? The field can't calculate a number because there isn't one that makes tactical sense. Sure, if you threw an entire of millions of Orks at a single Dreadnought, eventually it would run out of ammunition and be dragged down through sheer weight of numbers. But that's not a fight. That's a waste of perfectly good boys who could be out having proper scraps elsewhere. The field recognizes this and broadcasts a clear message. This fight is not worth it. There's an additional factor that's often overlooked: the psychic weight of a Custodian Dreadnought. The Custodian entombed within is a being who stood in the presence of the Emperor, who trained for decades or centuries to achieve perfection, who possesses a will so indomitable that they chose to continue serving even when their body was destroyed. This creates a psychic presence that, while not overtly psychic in the way a psyker's powers are, still registers on the field as something significant. It's the weight of authority, of absolute conviction, of a will that cannot be broken or diverted. Orks are highly sensitive to this kind of psychic presence because it's how they determine who's in charge. The biggest Ork naturally becomes boss, because other orcs can feel his dominance. When they encounter a Custodian Dreadnought, they're feeling something similar but magnified to an almost incomprehensible degree. It's not just that this enemy is powerful, it's that this enemy possesses a quality of absolute certainty, of unchallengeable supremacy. The machine doesn't doubt its ability to destroy anything that opposes it, because it has no reason to doubt. That confidence, backed by actual capability, creates a psychic presence that the field interprets as, "do not engage." This is fundamentally different from fear in the way other species experience it. Orcs aren't afraid of dying. They accept death as a natural part of a good scrap. They're not afraid of pain. Their physiology renders them largely insensible to suffering that would incapacitate other creatures. What triggers? Their avoidance instinct is the recognition that engaging this particular enemy serves no purpose. It's not fun. It's not glorious. It won't result in impressive trophies or exciting stories. It's just death, pointless and final, without even the satisfaction of having tried your best against a worthy foe. The field's response to Custodian Dreadnoughts is so strong that it can override even direct orders from a war boss. Imagine a scenario where a big boss points at a golden giant and yells, "Go crump dat thing!" The boys would hesitate. They'd look at each other, suddenly finding reasons why they personally shouldn't be the first one to charge. Maybe their chopper needs sharpening. Maybe they left their stick bombs in the other truck. Maybe they should go find more boys first to make sure the job's done proper. This isn't cowardice in the traditional sense. It's the orc survival instinct asserting itself over their combat enthusiasm. Of course, war bosses are bigger and meaner than regular orcs, and their own psychic presence in the field is stronger. A truly powerful war boss might be able to force boys to charge a Custodian Dreadnought through sheer force of will and the threat of immediate violence for disobedience. But even then, the charge would lack the enthusiastic ferocity that characterizes normal orc attacks. The boys would go forward because not going forward means the boss will kill them, not because they genuinely want to fight the golden giant. This fundamental lack of enthusiasm would show in their fighting style, making them even less effective than usual. The most telling evidence of how orcs perceive Custodian Dreadnoughts comes from what happens in the rare instances when they do engage. The orcs don't laugh. They don't whoop and holler. They don't enjoy the fight. They just try to survive and accomplish their objective as quickly as possible, and then they get away from the area. For a species whose entire psychology revolves around the joy of combat, this change in behavior is profound. It reveals that at some deep level, orcs recognize Custodian Dreadnoughts not as enemies to be fought, but as forces of nature to be avoided, like trying to fight a hurricane or argue with gravity. The Dreadnought deployment reality. Understanding why orcs so rarely engage Custodian Dreadnoughts requires examining not just psychological factors, but practical realities of how and where these war machines actually deploy. The Adeptus Custodes are not a conventional military force, despite their unmatched combat capabilities. They are the Emperor's personal bodyguard, bound by oaths and duties that supersede normal strategic considerations. This fundamental purpose shapes every aspect of how they're deployed, including when and where their dreadnoughts see action. During the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, when Custodian Dreadnoughts were more numerous and actively deployed across various theaters, their primary role was protecting the Emperor and securing critical Imperial assets. They didn't garrison worlds or patrol sectors. They appeared when the Master of Mankind himself took the field, or when objectives of supreme importance required the absolute certainty that only the Custodian Guard could provide. The Battle of Gyros Thravian, discussed earlier, represents exactly this deployment pattern, a situation so dire that it required the Emperor's direct intervention, bringing with him his Golden Warriors, including their dreadnoughts. After the Emperor was interred in the Golden Throne following his battle with Horus, the Adeptus Custodes withdrew almost entirely from active campaigning. For 10,000 years, they stood vigil over the Imperial Palace on Terra, leaving the defense of the wider Imperium to Space Marines, Imperial Guard, and other military organizations. During this long period of isolation, Custodian Dreadnoughts would have seen action only in the defense of Terra itself, or during the extremely rare occasions when Custodians ventured forth on specific missions deemed critical to the Emperor's safety or the Imperium's survival. This limited deployment pattern has several significant implications for Ork encounters with Custodian Dreadnoughts. First, and most obviously, if the Custodes aren't leaving Terra except under extraordinary circumstances, the opportunities for Orks to even see a Custodian Dreadnought become vanishingly rare. Ork wags have threatened Terra on several occasions throughout Imperial history, but these are exceptional events. The vast majority of Ork conflicts happen on frontier worlds, in wilderness space, or in contested sectors far from the throne world. Custodian Dreadnoughts simply aren't present in these areas. Second, when Custodes do deploy, they do so in response to threats of extreme magnitude. The threshold for bringing out a Custodian Dreadnought is incredibly high. These are irreplaceable relics, each one containing a warrior whose experience and skill represent thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and capability. The Adeptus Custodes don't risk them lightly. By definition, any situation that merits their deployment is one where the enemy is already facing overwhelming force. The Custodian Dreadnought isn't the entire Custodes response. It's part of a larger strike force that likely includes regular Custodians, Sisters of Silence, and possibly even Imperial Guard or Space Marine elements. This creates a scenario where Orks encountering a Custodian Dreadnought are already in a fight they're likely losing. They're facing not just the Dreadnought, but everything that came with it. The field is already registering multiple high-threat targets, and the Custodian Dreadnought represents just one more, albeit particularly dangerous, element in an already overwhelming enemy force. In this context, Ork behavior makes perfect tactical sense. Withdraw from this fight, regroup, and find a battle where the odds aren't quite so stacked against you. The rarity of Custodian Dreadnoughts extends beyond deployment patterns to sheer numbers. Even during the height of the Great Crusade, there were fewer than 100 Custodian Dreadnoughts in existence. This is a minuscule number when you consider the scale of the galaxy and the countless battlefields across which the Imperium fought. For comparison, the Space Marines fielded thousands of dreadnoughts across their legions. The Adeptus Mechanicus has entire forge worlds dedicated to producing military equipment. But Custodian Dreadnoughts are handcrafted masterworks, each one requiring resources and expertise that simply aren't available for mass production. In the current era of the 41st and 42nd millennia, the number of active Custodian Dreadnoughts is even smaller. Many ancient machines were lost during the Horus Heresy, or in the defense of Terra during various crises. The technology to create new ones has been partially lost, while the Custodes maintain their existing dreadnoughts with religious devotion. Creating new chassis from scratch would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. Each functioning Custodian Dreadnought is effectively unique, a relic from a bygone age that cannot truly be replaced if destroyed. This rarity means that even among the broader Imperium, few people have ever seen a Custodian Dreadnought. Most Imperial Guard officers, many Space Marine commanders, even some Inquisitors, have never witnessed these machines in action. They know of them from legends and historical accounts, but direct observation is incredibly rare. For Orks, whose collective memory operates through the Gestalt and accumulated cultural knowledge, this creates an interesting situation. Most Orks have never encountered a Custodian Dreadnought, and likely never will, yet the knowledge that they should be avoided seems to persist in the Gestalt consciousness. This suggests that the field's response to Custodian Dreadnoughts isn't entirely based on learned behavior or accumulated cultural memory. Instead, it appears to be a more fundamental reaction to the nature of the threat itself. When an Ork does encounter a Custodian Dreadnought, the field's assessment is so dramatically negative that the experience gets encoded into the Gestalt at a deep level. Other orcs who weren't present can sense this imprinted warning, creating a species-wide knowledge that these particular enemies are different. The few documented instances of orcs encountering Custodian dreadnoughts support this interpretation. During the closing years of the 30th Millennium, when the Custodians were still actively campaigning, there are fragmented records encountering Custodian forces that included dreadnoughts. In every case, the Orc forces either withdrew immediately upon identifying the dreadnoughts or suffered catastrophic casualties attempting to engage them. These defeats were so complete, so absolute, that they seem to have created lasting impressions in the Orc gestalt, consciousness. One particularly notable account, though fragmentary and possibly apocryphal, describes a war boss who specifically ordered his boys not to engage "dem gold giants what don't die proper." The war boss had apparently witnessed a Custodian dreadnought in action during a previous campaign and recognized that attempting to fight such an enemy would accomplish nothing except getting his best fighters killed for no gain. This represents a level of strategic thinking unusual even for war bosses, who are generally the smartest and most tactical orcs. The fact that this boss felt strongly enough about avoiding Custodian dreadnoughts to make it an explicit order suggests he understood something fundamental about the futility of such engagements. There's also the question of what happens after a Custodian dreadnought engagement. Orcs who witness these machines in action and survive to tell the tale would spread that knowledge through the Gestalt field. The story wouldn't be about "the time we fought dem golden gits," phrased in the typical Orc manner of boastful recollection. Instead, it would be a warning: "Don't fight that thing, it ain't worth it." This kind of negative reinforcement, rare in Orc culture, indicates just how thoroughly Custodian dreadnoughts violate Orc expectations about combat. The deployment patterns of Custodian dreadnoughts have shifted somewhat in recent years following the opening of the Great Rift and the resurrection of Reboot Guilliman. The Primarch's return prompted a reassessment of the Adeptus Custodes role, with Captain General Trajan Valoris authorizing more aggressive deployment patterns. Custodes forces have been seen operating beyond Terra with greater frequency, responding to critical threats across the Imperium Sanctus. This potentially means more opportunities for Orcs to encounter Custodian dreadnoughts, though the numbers involved remain tiny compared to the scale of galactic warfare. However, even with this renewed operational tempo, Custodian dreadnoughts remain concentrated around the most critical battles. They deploy to defend shrine worlds of extreme religious significance, to protect crucial Mechanicus Forge worlds, to secure strategic positions that must not fall under any circumstances. These aren't the kinds of battlefields where Orcs typically operate. Greenskins prefer targets of opportunity, poorly defended agri-worlds, isolated mining colonies, merchant convoys traveling through wilderness space. The high-value targets that merit Custodian dreadnought deployment are usually heavily fortified and prepared, making them less attractive to opportunistic Orc raiders. The practical reality is that most Orc Imperial conflicts happen at a level of warfare where Custodian dreadnoughts are completely unnecessary. Threatening a hive world might be massive by local standards, involving millions of Orcs and requiring multiple Imperial Guard regiments to counter. But from the Imperium's strategic perspective, this is a regional problem, not an existential crisis. Space Marines might be deployed if the situation is particularly serious, but Custodes? Never. The Adeptus Custodes respond to threats against Terra, against the Emperor's domains, against the fundamental stability of the Imperium itself. Regular Orc invasions, no matter how destructive locally, don't meet that threshold. This creates a self-reinforcing pattern where Custodian dreadnoughts and Orcs simply operate in different spheres of the 41st Millennium's endless warfare. The Orcs fight countless battles across thousands of worlds, but those battles don't typically involve the kinds of strategic assets that would prompt Custodian deployment. Meanwhile, the situations that do merit Custodian dreadnought deployment are usually so critical and so dangerous that any Orc forces present are either annihilated or flee before they can engage the dreadnoughts directly. The two forces exist in the same galaxy, but rarely in the same battlefield space. No glory in hopeless battles. Perhaps the most fundamental reason Orks avoid Custodian Dreadnoughts stems from the core of what motivates greenskin psychology, the concept of a good fight, and what that actually means to an Ork. To understand this, we need to move beyond the surface-level perception of Orks as mindless violence addicts and examine the sophisticated, if alien, value system that governs their behavior. Orks don't just want to fight, they want to fight well, to test themselves against worthy opponents, and to emerge with stories worth telling and trophies worth taking. Combat, for Orks, is performance art, social bonding, religious experience, and entertainment, all rolled into one culturally defining activity. When an Ork charges into battle, they're seeking specific experiences and outcomes. They want the visceral thrill of combat, the satisfying crunch of a chopper hitting armor, the excitement of not knowing whether the next moment will bring victory or death. They want to demonstrate their prowess to their fellow Orks, earning respect and potentially rising in the hierarchy through displays of strength and cunning. They want to claim trophies, whether that's enemy equipment, body parts as decorations, or simply the memory of having fought well. Most importantly, they want the fight to be fun. And fun, for an Ork, means uncertainty, challenge, and the possibility of victory. This last point is crucial and often misunderstood. Orks don't require victory to be certain. In fact, a fight where victory is guaranteed would be boring. But they do require victory to be possible. The possibility might be slim, the odds might be terrible, but there has to be a path, however narrow, where the Ork can see themselves winning. This isn't about mathematical probability in the way humans might calculate it. It's about whether the fight has the right shape, the right feel, the right potential for the kind of glorious combat that makes life worth living. A good fight, from an Ork perspective, has several key characteristics. First, it should be properly brutal. The enemies should be tough enough to require real effort to kill, making each victory satisfying. Second, it should allow for individual prowess to matter. An Ork wants to feel like their own strength, cunning, and fighting skill contribute to the outcome. Third, it should offer the possibility of loot, glory, or both. Even if the Ork dies, they want their death to be memorable, something other boys will talk about. Fourth, and most importantly, the fight should be winnable through Orky methods, bigger numbers, more dakka, better hitting, or cleverer tactics. Custodian Dreadnoughts fail every single one of these criteria so completely that they represent the antithesis of what Orks consider a good fight. Let's examine each failure point in detail. The brutality requirement initially seems met. Custodian Dreadnoughts are certainly tough, requiring tremendous effort to damage. But there's a difference between tough and impossible to meaningfully harm. When an Ork hits an enemy and sees their chopper bite deep, sees the enemy react to the wound, sees blood or oil or sparks, that's satisfying even if the enemy keeps fighting. It creates a sense of progress, of accumulating damage that will eventually bring the foe down. Against a Custodian Dreadnought, that feedback loop doesn't exist. The Ork swings their chopper with all their might. The blade connects with Oromite armor, and nothing. Maybe a scratch in the paint if they're lucky. The atomantic shielding absorbs the impact energy. The armor plate underneath isn't even dented. The Dreadnought doesn't stagger, doesn't slow, doesn't acknowledge the hit at all. Then it casually swings one massive power fist, and the Ork simply ceases to exist, pulped so thoroughly that there's nothing left to identify. This isn't brutal combat. It's one-sided butchery. The Ork isn't fighting, they're being executed. The individual prowess factor collapses even more dramatically. In a normal fight, an Ork's skill and strength matter. A bigger Ork with a power claw might kill enemies that a smaller Ork with a chopper can only wound. A cunning Ork might flank an enemy or strike at a weak point. An experienced Ork might recognize enemy patterns and adapt their fighting style. All of this creates a sense of agency, of the individual Ork's abilities influencing the combat outcome. Against a Custodian Dreadnought, none of it matters. The biggest knob with the best equipment and centuries of fighting experience is exactly as doomed as the smallest boy fresh from the spore fields. The Dreadnought will kill them both just as easily, just as quickly, with no noticeable difference in effort required. This complete negation of individual ability strikes at the heart of Ork psychology. In a culture where might makes right and personal prowess determines social standing, facing an enemy that renders all prowess meaningless is deeply disturbing. It's not just that the Ork can't win, it's that nothing they do matters. Their strength, their equipment, their experience, their cleverness, none of it influences the outcome in any meaningful way. They might as well not even be there. The loot and glory aspects fail just as completely. Loot requires surviving the fight long enough to claim it, and glory requires witnesses to spread the tale. Orks fighting a Custodian Dreadnought rarely achieve either. They die too quickly for proper trophy taking, and the witnesses are usually too busy dying themselves to remember who did what. Even if an Ork somehow managed to damage a Custodian Dreadnought before dying, which is unlikely in the extreme, the story wouldn't spread as a tale of glory. It would be a warning. Grodd tried to fight the Gold Giant, got himself killed, and accomplished nothing. But the most damning failure is the fourth criterion: winnability through Orky methods. Orks have simple solutions to difficult problems. Enemy too tough. Bring more boys. Enemy too shooty. Close the distance faster. Enemy too numerous. Get more Daka. These solutions work against most enemies because most enemies have limitations. Bring enough boys and you can overwhelm Space Marines. Get enough Daka and you can suppress even fortified positions. Close fast enough and you can reach enemies before their shooting kills everyone. The Ork approach to warfare is fundamentally sound against normal opposition. Custodian Dreadnoughts break this logic through sheer capability. More boys doesn't help because the Dreadnought can kill boys faster than they can close distance, and even if they reach melee range, they can't actually damage it meaningfully. More Daka doesn't help because Ork shooting is notoriously inaccurate, and the few shots that hit bounce off adamantic shielding and auramite armor. Closing distance faster doesn't help because the Dreadnought's ranged weapons are more than capable of slaughtering charging Orks at any range. There's no Orky solution to this problem because the problem exists on a level beyond where Orky solutions apply. This is what the field is communicating when Orks encounter these war machines. None of our methods work here. And if Orky methods don't work, if overwhelming numbers and extreme firepower and direct assault all fail equally, then what's the point of fighting? The Ork isn't proving anything. They're not testing themselves against a worthy foe. They're not even dying gloriously in a fight that will be remembered. They're just ceasing to exist, erased from the battlefield by an enemy they can neither hurt nor evade. The absence of fun is perhaps the most telling factor. Orks laugh during combat. They whoop and holler, make jokes, mock their enemies, and generally treat warfare as the most entertaining activity in the galaxy. This isn't bravado or false courage. It's genuine enjoyment. They really are having the time of their lives, even when they're losing. But when you read accounts of the rare engagements between Orks and Custodian Dreadnoughts, this characteristic Ork enthusiasm is completely absent. The Greenskins fight grimly, desperately, trying to accomplish their objectives and get away as quickly as possible. They're not enjoying themselves because there's nothing to enjoy. It's just death, impersonal and inevitable. Compare this to how Orks behave when fighting other extremely dangerous enemies. Against Tyranid Carnifexes, those massive bioengineered monsters that tower over normal infantry and can rip apart tanks with their claws, Orks still charge with enthusiasm. The Carnifex is dangerous, yes, but it's comprehensively dangerous. It's big and tough and kills lots of boys, but those boys can fight back, can damage it, can bring it down through persistence and numbers. The fight has the right shape. Against Chaos Dreadnoughts, piloted by ancient traitor marines, Orks see a proper challenge. A big metal git that needs crumping, just like any other vehicle. Against even greater demons, manifestations of chaos gods that can level city blocks, Orks will fight because demons can be hurt by sufficient violence and represent interesting new types of enemy. But Custodian Dreadnoughts don't fit into any of these categories. They're not biological creatures that can be worn down. They're not machines with obvious weak points. They're not supernatural entities vulnerable to certain tactics. They're perfect instruments of war, piloted by perfect warriors. And perfection leaves no room for the kind of opportunistic violence that defines Ork warfare. There's no trick to use, no weakness to exploit, no approach that offers better odds than any other approach. It's just pure, undiluted martial superiority, backed by technology and skill that the Orks cannot match. The field's recognition of this creates what might be called cognitive dissonance, if Orks were capable of experiencing cognitive dissonance. They simultaneously believe that Orks can beat anything if they're orky enough about it, while also instinctively knowing that Custodian Dreadnoughts represent an exception to this rule. The typical Ork response to this contradiction is simple. Don't think about it too hard, and definitely don't go near those gold giants. Find a different fight, one that makes sense, one that offers the proper combination of challenge and winnability that makes combat worthwhile. This isn't cowardice in any meaningful sense. Orks aren't afraid for their lives. They accept death as a natural consequence of combat. What they're avoiding is pointless death, death that accomplishes nothing and offers no satisfaction. If dying in battle guaranteed a place in Gork and Mork's eternal war in the afterlife, as Ork mythology suggests, then dying well matters. A glorious death against a worthy foe who you hurt before they hurt you is good. A pointless death where you're erased from existence without even touching your enemy is bad. The field helps Orks distinguish between these types of death, guiding them toward fights worth dying in and away from fights that represent mere annihilation. In the end, Custodian Dreadnoughts exemplify everything Orks instinctively avoid in an opponent. Invulnerability without hubris, lethality without rage, and competence so absolute that it leaves no room for chance or chaos. They are order incarnate, precision made manifest, the absolute antithesis of everything Orky. And in recognizing this, in understanding at a fundamental level that there's no fun, no glory, and no point in fighting these particular enemies, Orks demonstrate a wisdom that many would think impossible for their species. They understand that discretion isn't cowardice when valor would be meaningless. Conclusion: the exception that proves the rule. In the grim darkness of the far future, where war is the only constant and violence permeates every aspect of galactic civilization, the fact that Orks won't willingly fight Custodian Dreadnoughts stands as a remarkable anomaly. This isn't just an interesting quirk of battlefield behavior. It reveals profound truths about both species and illuminates the complex mathematics of power that governs the 40,000th millennium. The Greenskins, engineered in ages past to be the perfect warriors, capable of fighting any foe anywhere under any circumstances, have found the one enemy type that breaks their combat psychology so completely that they choose not to engage. This choice, or more accurately, this instinctive avoidance, demonstrates that Orks are far more sophisticated than they appear. Their refusal to fight Custodian Dreadnoughts isn't random superstition or inexplicable fear. It's a rational response to an enemy that exists outside the parameters of what Orks consider worthwhile combat. The Gestalt field, that psychic network connecting all Greenskins, performs a crucial cost-benefit analysis when facing potential opponents. Against virtually every enemy in the galaxy, that analysis concludes, this is dangerous, but we can win, and even if we lose, we'll have fun trying. Against Custodian Dreadnoughts, the analysis is stark and unambiguous. This isn't a fight, this is execution. Avoid. The mathematical reality supports this assessment. A single Custodian dreadnought represents a concentration of martial prowess, technological superiority, and defensive capability that no reasonable number of Orks can overcome without suffering catastrophic casualties for negligible gain. The historical examples we have, particularly the Battle of Gyros Thravian, where 1,000 Custodians killed over 100,000 Orks, while losing only 3 of their own, demonstrate that this isn't hyperbole or imperial propaganda. It's simply the reality of how much more effective the Custodian Guard is compared to virtually any other military force. When that already overwhelming advantage is combined with the force multiplication of being entombed in a dreadnought chassis, equipped with weapons and defenses that the Imperium can no longer fully replicate, and piloted by a warrior whose consciousness has been preserved specifically because their skill and experience were too valuable to lose, you get something that transcends normal battlefield calculations. A Custodian dreadnought isn't just a powerful unit. It's a walking denial of the premise that numerical superiority and aggressive tactics can overcome any defense. For Orks, whose entire martial philosophy is built on that premise, this represents an incomprehensible contradiction that their psyche resolves through avoidance. The rarity of Custodian dreadnoughts ensures that most Orks will never face this dilemma personally. The Golden Giants appear only at the most critical moments, defending only the most vital Imperial assets, deployed only when failure is absolutely not an option. This limited deployment pattern means that Custodian dreadnoughts remain legendary rather than commonplace threats in Ork consciousness. They're the bogeyman of the field, the enemy type that proves that even Orks have limits to what they'll voluntarily fight. Yet this exception doesn't diminish the Orks. If anything, it demonstrates their underlying intelligence and survival instinct. A species that charged blindly at every enemy regardless of circumstance wouldn't have survived and thrived across tens of thousands of years. The Orks' success as a galactic power comes partly from their knowing when to fight and when to find a better fight elsewhere. Their recognition that Custodian dreadnoughts represent enemies better avoided than engaged shows tactical sophistication that their crude appearance and behavior might otherwise obscure. For the broader Warhammer 40,000 setting, this dynamic illustrates the extreme power differentials that exist between different tiers of military capability. Imperial Guard soldiers are effective in their numbers and equipment. Space Marines are dramatically superior to Guard, capable of accomplishing mission objectives that would require entire regiments of normal humans. The Adeptus Custodes exceed even Space Marines by a similar margin. And Custodian dreadnoughts represent the absolute pinnacle of individual combat capability that the Imperium can field. The fact that even Orks, who will fight literally anything, recognize and respect this hierarchy says something profound about just how vast the gap is between baseline and peak performance in the 41st millennium. It's worth noting that this avoidance behavior specifically applies to ancient Custodian dreadnoughts, not necessarily to regular Custodians. Orks have fought and will continue to fight the Adeptus Custodes when their paths cross. The Golden Warriors are extraordinarily dangerous, yes, but they're still flesh and blood, still vulnerable to sufficient violence, still comprehensible as opponents. A war boss might look at a squad of Custodians and think, that's gonna be a right proper scrap. And they'd be correct, even if proper scrap means most of the boys are going to die. The fight would still have the right shape, the right feel, the right potential for glorious combat. But the dreadnoughts, those are something else entirely. They're the warriors who were already beyond peer, encased in war machines that multiply their capabilities to levels that break Ork combat psychology. They're not enemies to be fought, they're disasters to be avoided, like trying to punch a volcano or argue with physics. The field recognizes this distinction and broadcasts its warning. Custodians are dangerous. Custodian dreadnoughts are something else. Pick different fights. This understanding will likely persist as long as both species exist. The Orks won't suddenly develop weapons or tactics that let them effectively engage Custodian dreadnoughts, Because the problem isn't tactical or technological. It's fundamental. The Dreadnoughts will remain rare enough and powerful enough that they exist in a category separate from normal enemies. And Orks will continue to do what they've always done. Fight everything else with unbridled enthusiasm, while instinctively giving those golden giants a wide berth. In the end, the story of why Orks won't fight Custodian Dreadnoughts is the story of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, and the unstoppable force goes, "You know what? There's probably something else we can stomp instead." It's practical, it's smart, and it's perfectly Orky in its own way. Because real cunning isn't about fighting everything. It's about knowing which fights are worth taking. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40,000's most interesting behavioral quirks, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore all sorts of fascinating lore and mechanics from the grim darkness of the far future, and there's always more to discover in this rich universe. What other unusual dynamics or behaviors in Warhammer 40k would you like to see explored? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but even warriors know when discretion is the better part of valor.